you doing, guys? Today we are continuing some work on the fender pan. As you can see, since the last video I did go ahead and spray some primer filler all over it. Not getting too crazy, just making sure I was focusing on the tops of the fenders, the back area, and then the front side of each one of the fenders. In the center here I didn't really go too crazy because it's all covered up by the seat. I did start to just dry sand it with 220 just to see how things were going to lay out just in these two areas, here and in the middle, and it's looking like it's going to lay out pretty nice. In the sun, when I pull back, the lines look pretty straight, pretty good, right where I want them to be. Same with the shadow line in the front. I think that looks fairly symmetrical, enough closeness between the two of them that once it's on the tractor you're not going to really worry about it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start to wet sand this down with 500 grit. One thing I did notice, I should mention real quick, is that the lines here, the upper line of the body line, just wasn't right. So before I even started sanding the primer, I went ahead and just put some spot putty in there. I think the first thing I'm going to do, and then obviously I dinged the primer right there. So I'm going to just sand this down. I'm going to straighten this edge out, and then I'm going to start to wet sand the primer down with 500 grit, and hopefully it'll be close enough where I can just put one more final coat of primer on it, and then we can start talking about finishing it. So before we get that far, let's get the edges straight and start sanding this primer down. Just before I go ahead and start wet sanding this with 500, I decided to go ahead and sand down these body lines. I got this body line pretty darn close. I got a little bit of a mess up right here, and it needs a little bit of sanding right here. But I think that is pretty much, I'm going to call that pretty much like 80, I say that about 90%, maybe 95%, maybe just a touch of sanding left. This side, though, unfortunately, is not quite as good. I need to sand this area down, get this a little lower. Obviously, I have this little crease that I need to fill in, so I'm going to just go ahead and touch this a little bit with the sandpaper. I'm doing it with 220 on a paint stick, like a wood paint stick. Just cut a chunk of the wood paint stick off to help me there. So I'm going to continue working this over a little bit. I'm going to maybe just barely touch this. I don't even think I'm going to. I think I'm just going to leave it alone. And then I'll start the wet sanding process. But I wanted to give you a little shot of what I've been doing, or what I've done so far. So 220 paint stick, a little bit of spot putty. It's almost all done. This side's great. I'm real happy with this side. All right, let me get the sanding again. This is what I mean by a little piece of paper, sandpaper on a stir stick. So with the edges kind of resanded with the primer, you can see that the body line is really starting to get dialed in, which is good. Same with this side. Actually, this side's sanded a lot better than I thought initially. So I'm just going to hit it with some primer, see what it looks like. I'll probably let it sit because I'm going to start to, I think I've overworked it a little bit, and start doing the 500 grit sanding of the primer on the other side of the fender pan. But really the reason why I'm spending so much time in this area on both these sides of the fender is this. When I do a project like this and I want to try to hide that this thing has been messed with, so that way it's pretty unnoticeable. The one thing that's going to be a dead giveaway is this area right here and this area right here. If these body lines aren't really close, this line comes down, doesn't really match up real nice. Same on this like triangular section. When you look at the back of the tractor, or even if you're working on an old car, like when I was doing my 65 GS, these are focal points. If this line doesn't carry, your eye doesn't have naturally just carry this line, fairly smooth, instantly your brain's going to be like, what's that? Why is that like that? So that's why I'm kind of trying to really dial in this back section more so than anywhere else on the tractor, because really, with the seat here, you're really not going to see this body line so much, so you don't have to worry about that. Same with this. Obviously, this body line inside, totally not seen. We do have this area right here, but this area with the shifter and the steering wheel, your eye's not going to go from here to hear. Clearly this bird doesn't like me talking about this. But I'm just going to go ahead and start wet sanding this down. All this looks real good. This looks real close. So I'm happy with that. Where's that bird? There's that thing flying away. Finally. All right, guys. Back to it. So I started sanding the primer down with 600 grit wet. And I did the top of this fender and along this side. And it really feels good. I have one little blow through right here to the steel, not a big deal. And when I was painting, I had a bug in it right there, right at the end of my finger. You can barely see it, but of course that thing went all the way down to the to the base. But other than that, if I can get, I'm hoping I can get this to show up a little bit. You know, the visual down this. It's about as smooth as I'm going to get it. I mean, that thing is pretty darn flat. This body line right here is actually better than factory. So I'm real happy with this. So I'm going to continue to go ahead and sand this. And I'm just using it wet dry, 600 grit sandpaper with a little rubber block that I have. And, you know, crisscross pattern. And just watching my edges, keeping in mind where I do have high spots. I know I have a high spot right here. I can even feel it. Got to work around that so that way I don't burn through. Obviously along these edges here, got to be careful. As you can see, it's starting to line out real nice. And I put a little bit more spot putty here just to fix this, but that looks real good too. I'll just shoot that with some primer before I call it a night, so that way it'll dry over the next 12 to 16 hours. But I'm going to continue sanding and I will show you my progress in 1 second. So the first coat of primer surfacer has been wet sanded with 600 grit. It's actually in really good shape. I do have some blow throughs. You know, there's a pretty good one right here. That's the reason I'm going to put one nice even coat of primer surfacer on it. But if you take a look at the sideways, I'm hoping the camera will pick it up. It's pretty straight. I mean, this thing is in pretty darn good form. I'm real happy with the way this thing has come out. I mean, all the edges are pretty straight. The front is real nice and smooth. It feels great. I just wiped it down with wax and grease remover, so I'm not going to rub my hand on it. But I am going to get prepped, and we're going to go ahead and put one good even coat of primer surfacer on the whole thing, and I'll let that cure for about 24 hours, and then I'll just do one more entire wet sand of 600 grit over the entire surface. Hopefully it will blow through very little, and then we can move on to the actual painting process. With the primer surfacer sprayed on, you can really start to see the kind of like the final look of the fender pan. And overall I'm pretty happy with it. There are a few little things that I need to kind of fix or address. One thing is the body line coming down right here. I'm sorry, the camera might not be angled correctly because there's a glare, but it kind of fades away, while on this side it's pretty pronounced a little further down. So I'm going to need to fix that, so to speak. Also, this little angle on both sides is not perfectly smooth, so I'm going to have to sand those two areas down. One little point of interest, which I find kind of funny, but it's actually the stamping of the metal that is kind of messed up. If you look right here, this little piece right here, it's fairly wide, but on this side it's fairly narrow, these little triangles. So you say, well, I kind of messed it up when I did the body line. Well, number one, the cut line is like right here. I didn't even touch this. But if we look at this little whoop-de-doo right here, see how short that is? And you see this little whoop-de-doo here? You see how long that is? There's like an extra little piece. This whole thing is shifted over. So when they stamped it originally, you could tell that it was a little messed up. This whole little piece here is shifted. There's not much I can do about it. I'm just going to leave it alone. But I am just going to sand this all down, make this all nice and pretty. And then we're going to move on. So let's get to wet sanding. I started the wet sanding using 600 grit in order to get everything nice and flat. I did spray a guide coat. I figured why not? You know, if we're going to do this, we might as well go full send and just go ahead and guide coat it. So I guide coated it with some etching primer. It's the only thing I could find. And it's good enough, as long as it's darker than the light gray. But ultimately I did that so I can go ahead and dial in my edges really, really good. And I'm hoping that you can see this, that it is, you know, this is a pretty crisp line, as well as the line right here before it starts to make the rollover. I want to make sure that's nice and straight. The front is real nice and flat. As you can hopefully see, it's a little difficult. I apologize, it's a little difficult to see through the camera lens here because the lighting is so crazy. I do have a high spot, obviously, right here. I'm just going to leave that alone. I'm not even going to bother with it. When I do the color, I'm just going to have to be careful. Remember, I have to take a note and remember not to hit that too hard. As you can tell, I did sand this down a little bit more, so that way it matches this a little bit, so that sharp line kind of comes and then terminates into a nice smooth line. Nice sharp line kind of terminates to a nice smooth line. So hopefully that'll look pretty good. As you can tell, hopefully it's ridiculously flat. There's no bobbles in it. I don't know if the camera's picking this up, but I'll give a few slow angles here so you can see the tops of the fenders should be mint, based on what I've seen thus far. Obviously I haven't gotten that far with it, but I am going to continue. I think now that I have this section particularly done, I think the next section I'm going to do is the top of this, just to make sure that the two fenders themselves are fairly even. Kind of a weird setting to show you the wet sanded primer, but I think the lighting in this area here gives a good example of how fairly straight all of my lines are. You can see going down the sides, everything looks pretty darn straight, or straight enough where I can start doing the finish coat on it. I don't know if it'll show pretty good in this direction, but everything looks pretty good. It's super flat. Maybe not in this particular area right here, because, you know, that's under the seat, so who cares? But, you know, it's flat. There's no waves in it. You know, if I go like this direction, you can see that the shadow lines are pretty darn straight. There does look like there's a wobble bobble right here. That's only because I kind of blew through to the through the lower primer coat. But in general, if we go like this, you can see the lines are nice and straight. So I'm real happy with it. The sides, see if I can get a shot of the sides. Both sides look really good and straight. The front is just about, this side's too dark. But, all right, so I'm going to start thinking about what I'm going to do for a finish coat. So I got the fender pan here set up in the backyard, as you can tell. I am going to go ahead and shoot the first color coat on it. The only thing I've done to it since you saw it last in the garage is I did shoot a little bit of self-etching primer in the two little bare spots just to cover them over. Just going to spray right over that once it flashes. But as you can tell, it's going to be done right here. I usually use, as you know in my videos, I use Duplicolor engine paint. I don't know exactly what the final finish is going to be on this, but obviously it's going to be wet sanded, buffed. It's going to be shiny. So with that, we'll leave the actual finishing for another video. Just wanted to thank you for your support. Thank you for all your wonderful comments. Please like, share, and subscribe if you could, please. You have a great day. Hopefully today will be good for me. This paint will lay out real nice, and I won't have any major issues. Let's hope for that. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching, and you have a great day.